An ongoing military standoff, nuclear proliferation on your doorstep, a great power tussle between the world's two largest economies, and domestic political gridlock. The challenges facing South Korea are enough to make any policymaker turn grey. Despite this, Seoul's ability to adapt to its nightmarish situation has long been impressive. The very fact they've avoided nuclear Armageddon at the hands of their northern neighbour is testament to this. But signs are that in today's turbulent age, South Korea's room for manoeuvre is starting to narrow. As the domestic, regional, and global situation deteriorates, the odds are stacking up increasingly unfavourably. And that could prove to be a disaster for the entire world. Both Koreas boast formidable militaries and are backed by self-interested superpowers. Throw into the mix political instability and weak leadership at home, and the stage is set for things to turn ugly. When things heat up on the Korean Peninsula, everyone should be worried. Sadly, the temperature could soon rise all the way to that of a nuclear inferno. We all like to think that we are well informed, but if your news diet only includes a couple of mainstream outlets, odds are that you're not seeing the full picture, you're just seeing a picture. Take the recent Israeli missile strike on a hospital in Gaza. US outlets mostly framed it around Israeli defense operations and noted patients evacuated. Meanwhile, headlines from Al Jazeera and local Palestinian sources led with the humanitarian impact, overcrowded wards, civilians fleeing, the loss of a vital medical facility. It's the same event, but what's prioritized changes everything. Today's sponsor Ground News doesn't just show you both headlines, it lays them out side by side so you can see the difference. And their bias ratings tell you which way each source leans, whether that's left or right. Plus, there's the blind spot feed. That's where you can find stories that only one side of the political spectrum is covering at all. I've used Ground News to track stories like the one I mentioned, ones that are easy to misunderstand if you're only seeing one version. It's a great, eye-opening experience, and I'd recommend you try it too. Go to ground.news/warfronts to try it out. You'll get 40% off, unlimited access to the Vantage plan, and you'll start seeing the global news without the filter. Back to today's episode. A great power tug-of-war. It's not easy trying to please everybody. Unfortunately for the government in Seoul, sitting precariously at the point where two conflicting spheres of influence meet means having to do just that. With Washington and Beijing breathing down your neck, charting the best course of action is a delicate balancing act fraught with potentially dark consequences. Now, since you're watching this channel, we're going to guess you're already aware that the US and China are currently locking horns in a high-stake clash. A clash that's causing tensions to spill over and forcing other countries to choose a side. As a strategically located middle power with one foot in each camp, that means awkward times for South Korea. Given their shared history of military, economic, and diplomatic cooperation, Washington's efforts to draw South Korea further into its camp have unsurprisingly been more successful than its rivals. However, by retaining significant economic influence over South Korea and diplomatic sway over its arch-nemesis in Pyongyang, Beijing threatens to make life difficult if Seoul strays too far from neutrality. For Seoul, it's a bit like being a swimmer caught in a rip current. In a 2022 article, Vice Chair of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network, Chung In-moon, cited 4 fronts in this rivalry, stating that, quote, Washington has been pressing Seoul to endorse its Indo-Pacific strategy and participate in related military activities, to join American decoupling efforts in trade and investment, to form a technological alliance to cope with China's challenges, and to support America's campaign to criticize Beijing's violation of democracy and human rights. As the great power tug-of-war intensifies, South Korean policymakers must confront difficult questions before the rope finally snaps. On the geopolitical front, the fight to gain the upper hand in the Indo-Pacific theater is fierce. While Washington has endeavored to encircle and contain Chinese expansionism through diplomacy, strengthening alliances, and expanding its military presence, Beijing has employed a range of countermeasures. 1. In the South China Sea, China has been constructing and militarizing artificial islands and deploying the Coast Guard to harass other claimants. 2. In the diplomatic domain, institutions such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS are providing Beijing with multilateral platforms to shift international alignments. And 3. China's hybrid warfare campaign, which includes cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and undersea cable sabotage, has also been used to disrupt adversaries. On top of that, there's also good old-fashioned economic coercion. Taken together, it adds up to a pretty powerful deterrent against getting on Beijing's bad side. We can see this just by glancing at the caution with which Seoul treats its superpower neighbor. While South Korea is generally aligned with the United States' strategy to counter China's rise, the government hasn't exactly been as gung-ho as the Pentagon might have liked. This remains the case, even after Yoon Suk-yeol assumed the presidency in May of 2022 with a greater emphasis on his US alignment compared with his predecessor Moon Jae-in. For example, after a trilateral agreement was struck at the 2023 summit at Camp David, Seoul has participated in information sharing and joint military exercises with the United States and Japan. However, despite being an ally of Australia, the UK, and the US, Seoul has not pursued membership in AUKUS. Given the security group's greater focus on countering China specifically, such a move would likely provoke a backlash from Beijing. Seoul has also avoided condemning China's provocations concerning Taiwan and maintained minimal diplomatic and economic relations with the island, likely recognizing that this would be Beijing's ultimate red line. Now, turning our attention to the second front, you're likely familiar with the phrase, "money makes the world go round." Considering the trade war has taken center stage in the US-China confrontation, there is strong evidence to suggest that this idiom holds true. Now in its 7th year, the pair remain locked in a seemingly never-ending cycle of escalating tit-for-tat measures aimed at decoupling their economies. But what's this mean for South Korea? Well, a trade war between your two largest customers is never going to be ideal. With exports valued at $133 billion, China was South Korea's greatest foreign market in 2024, closely followed by the United States at $128 billion. China has already demonstrated its preparedness to weaponize its economic leverage. In 2017, after taking exception to South Korea's deployment of a US Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD missile defense system, Beijing, quote, launched an aggressive public campaign of economic retaliation. As one 2017 report from the US-China Economic and Safety Review noted, this included blocking market access for South Korean goods and services in the entertainment, consumer products, and tourism sectors, as well as authorizing cyber attacks on South Korean companies. Needless to say, this was not a fun time for Seoul. Nor was it even a fraction of the full weight of economic measure that China could potentially unleash. The warning there was clear as day. Now, moving on to the technological front, the recent wake-up call following the emergence of DeepSeek, aka China's answer to ChatGPT, and the country's access to advanced tech, encapsulates the fears surrounding this domain. It's no coincidence that Washington has targeted Beijing's access to US advanced semiconductors, telecommunications equipment, AI technology, and dual-use technology by imposing sanctions. As a global leader in semiconductors and 5G, the US views South Korea's technology sector as critical in limiting China's progression. However, despite pressure from Washington, South Korea's reliance on China for manufacturing and sales has discouraged Seoul from introducing stringent export controls. In March 2024, for example, US officials requested that the South Korean government restrict the flow of equipment and technologies for making high-end logic and memory chips to China. In an interview 6 months later, South Korean Trade Minister Cheong In-kyo embodied the government's stance, stating that, quoting here, "For countries or companies trying to comply with the US in good faith, there should be some kind of carrots." In other words, if you want us to join you, bring something to the table first. Don't just beat us around the face with a plank of wood like a misbehaving donkey. And lastly, with Western values such as democracy and human rights at odds with China's authoritarian structure and human rights abuses, Chung In-moon highlights ideology as the final front to be examined. From suppressing Buddhism in Tibet and quashing democracy in Hong Kong to persecuting Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, there is no shortage of human rights violations on China's record. Yet, despite sharing more ideological footing with the United States, pragmatism has resulted in Seoul adopting a bury-your-head-in-the-sand approach to China's transgressions. Just take Hong Kong. In 2019, protests spread like an extremely pissed-off wildfire across Hong Kong in response to a bill that would have allowed extraditions to mainland China. In South Korea, student protests in support of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement proliferated across university campuses, resulting in clashes between Korean and Chinese students. Walking the diplomatic tightrope, South Korean Foreign Minister spokesperson Kim In-chul issued a statement so wishy-washy you could use it to clean your Hyundai. Quoting here, "Hong Kong is an important region that has a close relationship with South Korea in terms of people-to-people and economic exchanges. We see it as important for prosperity and development in Hong Kong to be maintained under the one nation, two systems framework. In other words, I'm making this statement as boring as I can to avoid pissing anybody off. Seoul once again found itself in a difficult position after Beijing imposed the 2020 national security law to extinguish democracy in Hong Kong. While the US State Department invited South Korean diplomats to Washington to explain their position and galvanize international backing against China, to nobody's surprise, South Korea's response was muted to the point of near silence. As you probably gathered by this point, Seoul tends to focus on maintaining the status quo by avoiding any stance that might make one of its partners mad. Analysts refer to this strategy as strategic ambiguity. As one 2021 research paper published by Chatham House clarifies, Seoul does this, quote, to avoid becoming trapped in an overly adversarial relationship with China while limiting any dilution in its alliance ties with the US. Now, for a long time, this strategic ambiguity enabled South Korea to enjoy the best of both worlds, with a strong US security alliance and deep economic ties with China. But then, Donald Trump entered the room. Returning to the White House with the grace and decorum of an orange bull in a china shop, pun intended, Trump's second term has already seen many agreements and alliances once thought to be ironclad called into question. South Korean Trade Minister Cheong In-kyo may want carrots, but as long as Donald Trump is behind the wheel, there is only one thing he should be worried about, and that's the stick. Vice President J.D. Vance's February 2025 speech at the Munich Security Conference sparked uproar after he queried the United States' commitment to European security. The catastrophic Oval Office meeting between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky, combined with Trump's closer alignment with Russia, has further fueled concerns. But it isn't just Washington's European allies that fear the implications of the United States' America First foreign policy. Partners in the Indo-Pacific are in the same boat. Under President Biden, unilateral alliances such as the US, Japan, South Korea Trilateral Pact were considered a strategically useful means of checking China. But there's a new sheriff in town, and as one 2025 commentary from Chatham House points out, quoting again, unlike Biden, Trump views alliances as dependencies to be exploited by extracting maximum benefits to suit his America First agenda. So, what are the implications of this foreign policy change for South Korea? Well, it probably won't surprise you to hear that the answer can be summed up as not good. Democracy in the age of Trump. Now, to understand the effect of Trump's return and what it could have on Seoul, it's worth casting our minds back to his first administration. Now, back then, Trump crowed about using South Korea's strategic vulnerability and the US military's presence in the country as leverage to extort concessions. That leverage is extremely significant. Approximately 28,500 US military personnel are currently stationed across several military bases in South Korea. Previous presidents viewed this as a pertinent measure to deter North Korea and, in doing so, protect US foreign policy interests. Trump has taken a different line by instead complaining regularly about Seoul's financial contributions toward hosting US troops and even threatening to withdraw or redeploy them. Despite Trump demanding $5 billion annually from Seoul in 2019, that's more than 5 times what was being paid, the pair ultimately agreed to a one-year deal that raised South Korea's contributions by 8.2% to $930 million. Not one to let good facts get in the way of a good story, though. Trump later claimed on his social media platform, the ironically named Truth Social, that, quote, I had a deal for a full payment to us, billions. And Biden gave it away. Such a shame. In fact, under Biden, a 6-year agreement was reached in 2021, which saw South Korea agree to pay 13.9% more for the next 6 years. Don't be surprised, though, if Trump reopens this wound. In an April 2024 interview with Time magazine, Trump expressed that, quote, I think we're in a lot of places where we shouldn't be, and we probably aren't in some places where we should be. When asked about South Korea, he stated, quoting again, I want South Korea to treat us properly. I told South Korea that it's time that you step up and pay. They've become a very wealthy country. We've essentially paid for much of their military free of charge. Now, one flashpoint is tariffs. Trump has been systematically targeting countries that have large trade surpluses with the United States. In 2024, the US trade deficit with South Korea was $66 billion, a 29.2% increase compared with 2023. That is the 8th largest of any country with the US and $2 billion higher than Canada, which was recently hit with a 25% tariff on certain exports to America. Policymakers in Seoul were sweating bullets at the prospect of falling into Trump's crosshairs. According to Bloomberg, the mere threat of US tariffs could trim 0.8% from South Korea's GDP this year. Then, on April 2nd, 2025, a day hailed by Trump as Liberation Day, South Korea's nightmares were made real when it was slapped with a 25% tariff on its exports to the US. The pair had previously operated under a free trade agreement that came into force in 2012. Now, given Trump's penchant for changing his mind, it's possible that these tariffs have been reduced or paused between us recording this and you seeing it. It's also entirely possible that they've been paused, restarted, paused again, and then jacked up to some absurd number, such as the pain of trying to predict President Trump. Now, at the time of writing, Seoul isn't alone in its agony, with sweeping UF tariffs targeting every corner of the world. Even a group of barren volcanic islands near Antarctica were hit with a 10% tariff on its exports, despite being inhabited only by penguins. Still, unlike the anti-penguin tariffs, the ones on South Korea were at least foreseeable. 1 month earlier in March, Trump claimed that, quote, China's average tariff on our products is twice what we charge them, and South Korea's average tariff is 4 times higher. Think of that. 4 times higher, and we give so much help militarily and in so many other ways to South Korea. But that's what happens. South Korea's trade ministry heavily disputed Trump's assertions, arguing that tariff rates on imports from the US stood at around 0.79% as of last year under the bilateral free trade agreement. But in Trump land, truth plays second fiddle to extracting rent from helpless allies. Following Trump's Liberation Day announcement, acting President Han Duck-seo convened an emergency task force and vowed an all-out response. However, with Seoul needing to persuade the Trump administration to honor its military commitments while also contending with domestic pressure to retaliate against the measures, it would be fair to say government's in a bit of a pickle. And that may have led them to make some eye-popping choices. A few days before Liberation Day, on March the 30th, driven by a shared sense of impending financial Armageddon, South Korea, China, and Japan held their first economic dialogue in 5 years. The move was widely seen as an effort to promote regional and global trade in the face of Trump's tariff war. After the meeting, a Weibo post from Yuyuan Tantian, an account affiliated with Chinese state broadcaster CCTV, claims that the trio were coordinating a response to Trump's tariffs. Although South Korea's trade ministry pushed back on the idea, saying it was somewhat exaggerated, the diplomatic implications of Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing joining forces to do anything can't be overstated. This is why South Korea's position is so precarious right now. Not only are China and the US squaring up, but old alliances Seoul thought were rock solid are collapsing faster than consumer confidence. Still, Seoul isn't just a passive actor in all of this. According to Chung In-moon, there are 4 strategies available for South Korea when it comes to the Sino-American rivalry. The first involves doubling down on US alignment to counterbalance China's rise, which entails, quote, active participation in US-led regional military activities, joining the decoupling strategy in trade, investment and technology, and voicing greater objections to China's violation of human rights and democracy. Proponents argue that Chinese aggression warrants recognition as an outright threat to South Korea, and that failure to stand up to Beijing risks the Finlandization of the country, a reference to how Finland in the Cold War was able to keep its independence, but only after surrendering much of its sovereignty to its neighbor, the Soviet Union. For what it's worth, it's not difficult to envision US alignment receiving popular support. Anti-Chinese sentiment remains commonplace among South Koreans who have not forgotten Beijing's intervention on behalf of the North during the Korean War. However, the flip side is that South Korea would confirm itself as a Chinese opponent, and you can bet your bottom dollar that the CCP will look to set an example through retaliatory measures. South Korea's economy would suffer, and its national security would deteriorate if China climbed further into bed with Pyongyang by increasing weapons shipments and logistics support. When Yoon Suk-yeol took office in 2022, South Korea moved closer toward US alignment. Seoul reconciled with Tokyo, participated in its first NATO summit, and permitted dockings by US nuclear submarines in South Korean ports. However, with Trump shaking things up, South Korean leaders will be questioning the reliability of the US as a partner, which will only serve to weaken the argument for US alignment. The second option involves burning bridges with the US and realigning with China as the rising regional power. As Chung In-moon outlines, quoting here, "The bandwagoning China strategy could facilitate peace and stability, particularly if the US disengages from the Korean peninsula. However, if you belong to the Chinese sphere of influence, Beijing will take its pound of flesh. Without the US acting as a counterbalance, Finlandization would likely occur, as South Korea would have little option but to bow to China's every whim as its only major economic and military partner. Seoul would fall in line on China's human rights abuses to the detriment of its global reputation, participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, and fare economic uncertainty as relations become strained with the West." It's difficult to see this coming to fruition. Strong anti-Chinese sentiment among the population makes such a realignment difficult, and any attempt would face strong opposition. China's rising influence in the Indo-Pacific may have been a difficult pill for South Korea to swallow, but with its deeply entrenched security structure with the US, Seoul is unlikely to favor such an upheaval. A third option would be for South Korea to detach from the US-China rivalry altogether. In the minds of right-wing nationalists, doubts surrounding the US nuclear umbrella have cultivated a desire to develop a domestic nuclear program to safeguard national security. Left-leaning pacifists, meanwhile, argue instead for a Mongolia-style permanent neutrality by withdrawing US troops and terminating the US alliance. Although the idea of taking matters into your own hands does sound appealing, in the cold, unforgiving plane of existence that we call reality, neither interpretation is practical or feasible. While the nationalists' course of action would see tensions rise exponentially as nearby countries fear the prospect of a nuclear-armed South Korea, the pacifists would turn the country into a sitting duck. And finally, we have the strategy of maintaining the status quo, or in Chung In-moon's words, quoting again, "muddling through that is predicated on a simultaneous pursuit of an alliance with the US and a strategic cooperative partnership with China." Seoul has pursued this policy since the 1998 to 2003 presidential term of Kim Dae-jung. Referred to locally as security with the US, economy with China, this strategy, while not perfect, has gotten South Korea this far. However, nothing lasts forever, and there is a valid argument to be made concerning the declining efficacy of maintaining that status quo. During a 2011 presentation organized by the Institute for Foreign Affairs and National Security, political scientist Stephen Walt warned that, quoting here, "If Sino-American rivalry heats up, as I believe it will, then Beijing and Washington will press Seoul to choose sides." Fast forward 14 years, and it's clear he was right. With tensions continuing to rise, the status quo strategy is approaching a critical juncture. Essentially, Seoul's problem is the geopolitical equivalent of being caught between a rock and a hard place. Only in this case, both the rock and the hard place have nuclear weapons, instruments of economic coercion, and leaders that are determined to make their countries expansionist again. So, what exactly are you supposed to do if you're in South Korea's position? I mean, on the one hand, you've got good old Uncle Sam, a staunch ally during the Civil War, the provider of nuclear deterrent against Pyongyang, a counterweight to growing Chinese aggression, and a partner with whom you share a broad set of ideological principles. On the other hand, you've got the Dragon, an economic behemoth located just a stone's throw away, your most significant export destination, and the country with the greatest sway over your closest enemy, North Korea. Encapsulating the uncertainty surrounding South Korea's future foreign policy, one 2023 article published by East Asia Forum stated that, quote, "Whether Yoon's policies endure after his tenure is questionable, especially if a successor from the traditionally more anti-Japanese progressive side of politics emerges victorious." And that article was published before the domestic situation spiraled out of control. But we'll pick up on that again a little bit later. For now, regardless of Seoul's foreign policy moving forward, with the US and China squabbling over South Korea like divorced parents battling for child custody, expect things to keep getting feisty. And that's before we even dig into the biggest potential headache of them all, the living geopolitical migraine known as North Korea. Nobody likes a bad neighbor. Nobody likes a bad neighbor. They can be loud, noisy, or in South Korea's case, aiming nuclear warheads at you. And things have only gotten worse in recent years. For South Koreans, listening to politicians quarrel over the threat across the border must feel like listening to a broken record. After all, it's been this way for a while. Although the bloody fighting that occurred during the 1950 to 1953 Korean War was stopped by an armistice agreement with no formal peace treaty signed, it would be better to think of the conflict as on pause rather than resolved. Now, while this confrontation has never been straightforward, things have only become more complicated in recent years. A key reason for this is North Korea's nuclear weapons program, the second thing that comes to mind when most people think about the country, only behind Kim Jong-un's adorable little chubby cheeks. According to a 2024 report published by the Congressional Research Service, quoting here, North Korea continues to advance its nuclear weapons and missile programs despite UN Security Council sanctions and high-level diplomatic efforts. The country's ballistic missile testing, military parades, and policy statements suggest that North Korea is continuing to build a nuclear warfighting capability designed to evade regional ballistic missile defenses. North Korea has successfully tested an explosive nuclear device 6 times since 2006 and conducted over 80 ballistic missile test launches since 2022. Pyongyang has also been perfecting the designs of its thermonuclear warheads for a range of delivery systems, including short-range ballistic missiles, or SRBMs, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. In February 2025, Kim Jong-un marked the 77th anniversary of the Korean People's Army with a speech in which he reiterated his objective of expanding the country's nuclear program. Some analysts fear that Pyongyang's actions demonstrate an increasing preparedness to resort to nuclear weapons. For example, in September 2022, North Korea introduced a law that expanded the conditions under which they could be used, including the option of preemptive strikes if the regime perceives a threat. Although the significance of this could be questioned, given Pyongyang's history of using fear-mongering as a strategic tool, developing policy on the promise that North Korea is all bark, no bite could easily lead to Seoul's face getting metaphorically eaten. And North Korea's nuclear program is unlikely to go away anytime soon. The window for military action to stop its development slammed shut decades ago, and the US intelligence community's 2024 annual threat assessment conveyed that, quote, Kim almost certainly has no intentions of negotiating away his nuclear program, which he perceives to be a guarantor of regime security and national pride. So, the nukes are here to stay. But don't be deceived. The North Korean problem goes far beyond the threat of nuclear Armageddon. In recent months, Pyongyang has made strides to reduce its isolation by deepening ties with select partners. In September 2022, reports emerged that North Korea was sending armaments, including artillery shells and ballistic missiles, to support Moscow's war in Ukraine. In autumn 2024, this was expanded by Pyongyang, which sanctioned the deployment of troops. According to estimates from Ukrainian, US, and South Korean sources, North Korea has sent at least 11,000 soldiers, out of which 1,000 have been killed. Reports indicate that these troops have been sent in suicidal human waves to overwhelm Ukrainian positions with a total disregard for the fatalities incurred. Despite suffering heavy casualties, in February 2025, South Korea's intelligence agency said that North Korea had sent an additional 3,000 troops, many of whom were deployed to the front line in Kursk. According to South Korean intelligence officials, North Korea has received food, oil, money, and air defense missiles from Russia as payment. It is entirely plausible that North Korea will seek greater economic assistance and military technology in the future. One article from the Royal United Services Institute stated that, quote, it is fully anticipated that in return for its military participation, North Korea will demand to join the Russian-led Collective Security Organization, as well as other international organizations such as the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Russia will no longer be able to dither on such membership applications. End quote. This would elevate North Korea's status within the anti-Western world order and create a splitting headache for officials in Seoul. How do you deal with an aggressive northern neighbor when that neighbor can now call on both Beijing and Moscow to protect it? Although Seoul has done a commendable job of managing the North Korean threat so far, there are clashing schools of thought on tackling the growing problem. Clarifying the strategy shift seen in recent years, a 2024 article published by East Asia Forum highlighted that, quote, the Yoon administration has firmly rejected the prioritization of engagement with North Korea that was a foundation of the previous president Moon Jae-in's progressive government, embarking on an increasingly confrontational approach to the Pyongyang regime. End quote. Kim Jong-un was not happy. In January 2024, he declared reunification unfeasible and disbanded 3 organizations that dealt with the matter. A few months earlier, South Korean Defense Minister Shin Wok-sik summarized Yoon's approach as, quote, PISU, punish immediately, strongly, and until the end. He also emphasized a simple message that, quoting again, punishment is deterrence and deterrence is peace. South Korea has also developed the 3-axis system to provide a response framework before, during, and after a North Korean attack. The first component, known as Kill Chain, involves preemptively striking Pyongyang's nuclear and missile facilities following the detection of their intended use. The second axis is the Korea Air and Missile Defense System, which is designed to protect the country from both conventional and nuclear missile attacks by intercepting short and medium-range missiles. The third is the Korea Massive Punishment and Retaliation Plan, which endeavors to cut the head off the snake by eliminating North Korea's leadership with precision strikes and special forces operations. Describing South Korea's KMPR, an anonymous military source, said that, quote, every Pyongyang district, particularly where the North Korean leadership is possibly hidden, will be completely destroyed by ballistic missiles and high-explosive shells as soon as the North shows any sign of using a nuclear weapon. In other words, the North's capital city will be reduced to ashes and removed from the map. End quote. While you could be forgiven for thinking that South Korea's tough stance is a good thing for security relations, the approach is actually split opinion. In one 2022 article published by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Ankit Panda contended that, quote, continued signaling around decapitation intentions invites North Korea to take especially dangerous steps as it modernizes its nuclear forces and posture. Panda also cited concerns over provoking an arms race and doubts over South Korea's capability to eliminate Kim when push comes to shove. Donald Trump certainly adopted a stern approach when he threatened to unleash, quote, fire and fury like the world has never seen on North Korea should it threaten the US. Although meetings between Trump and Kim in Singapore, Hanoi, and the Korean demilitarized zone provided both sides with reasons to declare success, no tangible outcomes were achieved. The debate between where to fall on the scale of deterrence and diplomacy will remain contentious in South Korea for as long as the threat beyond the border persists. And you wouldn't put your money on that going away anytime soon. Yet it's not only from the outside that Seoul is facing threats and destabilization. As President Yoon recently showed, there's plenty to tear Korean society apart at home too. Gridlock at home. When South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law late in the evening on December 3, 2024, he unleashed a political whirlwind that is still blowing through society 4 months later. But make no mistake, Yoon was no stranger to controversy before this. Growing inequality, rising prices, escalating threats from North Korea, accusations of censorship, and vetoing bills to support farmers and nurses, as well as investigate his wife's questionable financial dealings, Yoon was more unpopular than a turd in a punch bowl. In fact, as of the second week of December 2024, only 11% of respondents approved of Yoon's performance in office, while 85% disapproved. It didn't help that he'd been a lame duck president since April 2024, when the main opposition Democratic Party won a landslide majority in the parliamentary election. Yoon was subsequently reduced to vetoing bills from the opposition party. Unsurprisingly, Yoon's claims that martial law was necessary to protect the country from North Korea's communist forces and eliminate anti-state elements failed to convince the public. Just hours after making the announcement, Yoon, with his tail between his legs, reversed course after lawmakers forced their way into the National Assembly to vote it down as thousands of protesters gathered outside. The lack of credibility behind the move was encapsulated by how Yoon initially cited North Korea as justification, before later blaming the opposition for using their majority to paralyze his government's agenda. Declaring martial law is always a drastic decision, but in South Korea, where there is a dark history of military rule, the issue's particularly sensitive. As the country rebuilt after the Korean War, leaders used martial law to suppress anti-government demonstrations. Army General Park Chung-hee, who served as president from 1962 until his assassination in 1979, did this several times. Major General Chun Do-hwan, who became president in 1980, similarly used martial law to consolidate his position and suppress opposition. As summarized by a recent article from the Atlantic Council, quoting here, the South Korean people fought with blood, sweat, and tears to institute a true democracy. It's under this context, with martial law in the living memory of many in the country, that South Korea was galvanized to call for impeachment for an already massively unpopular Yoon. With the world watching, the weeks following Yoon's botched martial law plunged the country into chaos. Between police confrontations, protests, and political gridlock, the events created a spectacle worthy of its own reality TV series. While the first attempt to impeach Yoon on December the 7th narrowly failed after members of the People's Power Party boycotted the vote, a second attempt on the 14th of December succeeded after PPP lawmakers were granted the freedom to vote. Although this delivered the result needed for South Korea's political processes to move forward, it quickly became clear that the situation would be anything but straightforward. In Yoon's stead, Prime Minister Han Duck-seo stepped in as acting president, only to be impeached less than 2 weeks later on December the 27th. In a move designed to bolster Yoon's chances of surviving the trial, Han's downfall stemmed from his decision to block the appointment of 3 additional judges to the Constitutional Court. However, in another twist, almost 3 months later, on the 24th of March, the court reinstated Han as acting president. With South Korea's political drama unfolding, it was time for law enforcement agencies to step up. The only problem was, they were woefully unprepared to do so. On December the 11th, the police raided Yoon's offices, only to find themselves blocked from securing critical documents by security. On the same day, Defense Minister Kim Yong-hun, who was detained for his role in the martial law situation, attempted to commit suicide while in custody. Then, on January 3rd, despite galvanizing a 150-strong force of political officers to arrest Yoon at his presidential residence, the authorities walked away empty-handed after a 6-hour standoff. This time, the combination of pro-Yoon supporters and presidential security agents stood in the way. Many began to ask the question, who exactly is in charge here? In the end, it required a force of 3,200 officers to besiege the compound and arrest Yoon on the 15th of January. So, mission accomplished? Well, no, not exactly, as on the 8th of March, Yoon was released on legal technicalities. While Yoon's release provided his supporters with some cause for celebration, this was short-lived. On March the 26th, the South Korean Appeals Court overturned a 2024 ruling that had found opposition leader Lee Jae-myung guilty of violating election laws. Had the decision been upheld, Lee, the clear frontrunner for the next election who narrowly lost to Yoon in the previous race, would have been barred from running for president. Then, on April the 4th, the final nail was hammered into the coffin when the Constitutional Court, after months of deliberating, unanimously upheld Yoon's impeachment. A snap presidential election will now be held on the 3rd of June, and the race is very much on. Things could get even worse for Yoon, who still faces a criminal trial for insurrection charges. Although this could lead to life imprisonment or the maximum sentence of the death penalty, the latter is unlikely considering South Korea has had an unofficial moratorium on execution since 1997. With the South Korean economy struggling, the North Korean threat growing, and Donald Trump dragging the country into a trade war and questioning South Korean security, the country is in dire need of political clarity. Over in Japan, Tokyo remains concerned about who will take the presidency now Yoon has been removed. The recent progress in bilateral relations could easily be reversed, given that Lee has accused Yoon of ignoring Japan's crimes against South Korea in the 1930s and 40s. Reigniting the debate over reparations could deteriorate relations between the pair at the worst possible time. One Atlantic Council article highlights that the trilateral security pact between South Korea, the US, and Japan could similarly be under threat, as, quote, "This political crisis will make it challenging to have high-level strategic coordination or make progress on key alliance issues." Although Lee has reiterated his support for South Korea's alliance with the US, his persistent criticism of Yoon's pro-American stance suggests potential friction with the Trump administration should he assume power. Concerning North Korea, there's also the risk that Pyongyang could initiate a confrontation of some sort to take advantage of South Korea at an inopportune moment. There's a reason why "together we stand, divided we fall" is such an overused phrase. Should South Korean security start to split apart now, all it might take is one almighty shove from Kim Jong-un to shatter the status quo on the peninsula into a million little pieces. No easy answers. So there you have it. It's a mess, isn't it? As you're aware, the domestic situation in South Korea is rapidly evolving. With an election on the near horizon, the country's domestic political upheaval is entering a new phase. Emotions continue to run high in a divided South Korea, and Yoon's conspiracy theories have taken root as far-right extremism grows. According to BBC News, quote, "More than a third of people now say they do not trust the Constitutional Court, which delivered Yoon's verdict. More than a quarter do not trust the voting system." Analysts remain sharply split over the strength and durability of South Korean democracy, and some argue that the country is in the grip of democratic decay. At a time of intense division, excessive partisanship, mass protests, and leaning toward populism, anything could happen over the next 2 months. Regarding the security threat posed by North Korea and the Sino-American power struggle, don't hold your breath. They're here to stay. And although South Korea will soon have a new leader to take the country forward and tackle these endemic issues, many may not accept the rule that comes. Even if the election unfolds smoothly, there is no guarantee that the deteriorating external situation will be manageable for the next government. From the escalating confrontation between the US and China to the declining situation with North Korea and the volatility brought by Donald Trump, many factors are outside of South Korea's control. That's not a comfortable position to be in. So, to whoever it is that ultimately shoulders the responsibility for navigating this minefield as South Korean president, well, good luck to you. Better you than me. Because, as we've hopefully shown in this video, it's fair to say that South Korea may now stand at its point of maximum vulnerability, caught between two rival superpowers, even as its democracy crumbles at home. Seoul has so far survived this dangerous balancing act, but it may only be a matter of time before the rope breaks, and this regional power plunges into the void, with consequences for us all. Thank you for watching.